become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Global civilization is clearly on the edge of failure.
What are you really afraid of?
Hast thou eaten of the fruit of the tree whereof I told thee thou shouldst not eat?
The moral to be drawn from this nightmare situation is a simple one.
You simply have to turn your back on a culture that has gone sterile and dead and get with the program of a living world and a re-empowerment of the imagination.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Fundamental changes in society are sometimes labeled impractical.
Our birth, our death, our being in the moment, these are mysteries. They are doorways opening on to unimaginable vistas of self-exploration.
The contemplation of death and the acceptance of death is very highly generative of creative life.
Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts.
The society is trying to cure itself by an archaic revival.
What account would we give of our stewardship of the planet Earth?
The world is not an unsolved problem for scientists or sociologists. The world is a living mystery.
I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel.
Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
Yeah, sure. My name's Sheldon Solomon. We're sitting where I work at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. I am, by training, an experimental social psychologist, and what I've been doing for the last 40 years with my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski, friends from graduate school, is to just study how the uniquely human awareness of death influences all aspects of human affairs. And this is based on a guy that we stumbled onto in the 1980s, Ernest Becker, a cultural anthropologist who had just written in 1973, a book called The Denial of Death, where he just pointed out that if you want to understand why people do what they do for both better and worse, then we have to step back and consider the implications of us being the only form of life that is poignantly and profoundly aware of the inevitability of death, even in situations where our lives are not directly threatened. Wow, yeah, these are great questions. So let's just start. We'll go back to Becker. His argument is that we're so smart that we realize that we're here. And that's extraordinarily uplifting and also psychologically devastating. If you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to know that, like all living things, you're going to die someday. You can die at any time for reasons that you can't control. And then there's the Becker point where he's like, and you realize you're an embodied animal, that like it or not, whatever you are is inextricably ensconced in a physical carcass that, like the rest of nature, ages and ultimately dies and then decays. And Becker's point is that if that's the only thing that we thought about, I'm going to die, I could walk outside, get smote by the pandemic, and I'm a breathing piece of meat, no more significant than an apricot or an armadillo. You wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. And what he argued is that what we do as human beings, quite cleverly, although quite unconsciously, to manage death anxiety, we embrace culturally constructed belief systems that allow us to function minute to minute by giving us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value, and that most such systems tend to be religious ones. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, what that entails is the supposition that human beings, at least those of us imbued with testicular fortitude by virtue of being in possession of a Y chromosome, are created in God's image, and therefore we are superior to and separated from nature. And the Becker argument is that that's a thinly veiled effort to distance ourselves from the rest of the world. The rest of the world dies, but those of us cloned in God's image are imbued with souls who thereby have the capacity to persist after we have expired. And it's on those grounds, Becker argued, that many of us, especially when existential anxieties are aroused, we resist the idea that humans are animals. And we know this from our experiments. When we remind people they're going to die, they take issue with the claim that humans are animals. They become uncomfortable with their bodies, even in situations that one would normally enjoy, like being massaged or engaged in sex, and we become uncomfortable in nature and more willing to greedily exploit it in the service of economic prosperity at the expense of environmental sustainability. So I think that both theoretically and empirically, this is why we have this very ambivalent relationship with nature. And this is not to say that everybody is this way, but by and large, we are a fundamentally death-denying culture who is much more comfortable surrounded by DoorDash and 24/7 access to Taco Bell than we are the horrific prospect of having to exist in a world that is not directly predictable, not directly controllable, and yet that's the world that we ultimately depend on for our physical survival.
Yeah, it's all an illusion. We built this grand illusion for ourselves to be comfortable in.
That's correct. And by the way, this is not an indictment of humankind. I say this to remind myself that we're all human. And the fact of the matter is that one of the things that I find most potent about these ideas is that I'm subject to them also. It's horrific to admit that there's sometimes if I reach in my pocket and I happen to have like $1, I'm comforted by that. All right, well, there's no McDonald's around. I'm walking in the woods and I'm like, ooh, I've got some money in my pocket. But like I always joke with the Skidmore students, if I say to you, what do you want, $1 million or a carrot? They're always, what are you talking about, flea dick? I want $1 million. And I'm like, well, if you haven't eaten for a day or two and I drop you on the top of a mountain, you might want to rethink that. When push comes to shove, as it will surely in the relatively near future, like Richard Dawkins, the guy who wrote The Selfish Gene, before he became a dick with his strident attitudes about atheists, he made a fine point in the 1970s, which is nature has a very fine way of taking care of humans when their beliefs about reality are sufficiently detached from it, and it's called starvation. And so here we are, just really persistently devoted to a cultural worldview based on the idea that we can grow our way out of anything. And the fact of the matter is that that's just simply not the case, although people of goodwill could disagree about anything. But my point is that infinite growth is only good for malignant tumors and compound interest, that in any other natural system, You don't want a positive feedback loop that culminates in increasing frenetic activity that spirals out of control. In nature, we want balance. We want homeostasis. We want to get to the point, to quote Mary Poppins, where enough is as good as a feast. And there is movement in what I would consider to be very optimistic directions in this regard. So there are economists, and this is to my discredit, there's a woman at Oxford who writes about the donut economics. And her point is that until we recalibrate, you mentioned this earlier, until we recognize that we're at the tail end of a cultural worldview that has produced benefits for all of us. And yet, if we continue to persist in our subscription to us, the end result will be fatal. And so this really is, I would say, a watershed moment where we are at the crossroads of human existence. Not that we haven't been here before, but it is an odd moment where you can say, on the one hand, things have never been better for lots of us, and yet the worst thing that can happen would be to listen to folks like Steven Pinker, with all due respect, who just says things have never been better. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. More free markets, more infinite growth. And that's where the John Grays of the world come in, the British philosopher who points out that this idea that we can grow our way out of anything and that progress is inevitable, that's not a rational conclusion based on sound economic policy. That's a death-denying delusion that will cause us all great harm until we're willing to relinquish it, which is understandably difficult, because if we take seriously what I've been blubbering about, which is that we embrace our cultural constructions in order to manage death anxiety, it is easier said than done to say to folks, here's why your entire view of the world is based on erroneous assumptions about human nature and progress. And yet we're going to have to be able to do that somehow.
Do you think that the omnipresent awareness of climate change, pandemics, and other forms of death cause us to double down onto the cultural symbols that created these problems to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. So brilliant, although, yes, brilliant observation. And I believe this helps us understand what would otherwise be astonishing and perplexing. Specifically, why is it in the midst of a pandemic, on top of economic insecurity, on top of political polarization and racial animosities, that it would be awesome back in the day, not to sound like Father Time, but there was a time, I wasn't here, but a century ago, when the economic and political shit hit the fan, we'd be like, wow, we have to do something. And yet right now, for the moment, I would say, as you put it very eloquently, Jake, that what's happened right now is that the pandemic has been like a giant death reminder in our studies. And in our studies, when we remind people of death, that they become more ethnocentric, they become more racist, they become more likely to support populist political leaders, they become more antagonistic to nature, they become more greedy, pursuers of money and stuff. And all forms of psychological disorders are amplified. Well, that's what we find in our studies, but that's what we're now finding in life. So here we are in the middle of the pandemic. Hate crimes against Asians are way up. Racial violence way up. Support for charismatic political leaders way up, and shopping way up, drinking way up. The capacity to step back and realize that in the absence of a radical reconceptualization of who we are and what life means, we're doomed way down. In other words, amongst many. I do think that the pandemic has been an astonishingly and potentially transformative wake-up call for some. This gives me great hope, because not to go all academic-y, but Nietzsche said, whatever in the Gay Science, when he said God is dead, this is in the 1870s, and his point is that we're on the cusp of the end of a dominant worldview. There's an Oswald Spengler dude after Nietzsche who wrote a book called Decline of the West, and Nietzsche just said, it's going to take 200 years of volatility and uncertainty before we're able to step back and think about what might be best for next steps. And it took the Great Depression and the last pandemic to nudge Americans into political and economic changes that I would submit have been good for everybody. Like Americans love Social Security. They love Medicare, they love eating, and none of those things existed prior to World War II, and they were ardently resisted. I don't want this to be a political argument, but it is, because Republicans in the United States, a century ago, I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, they do nothing as long as possible, and then when you have to do something, they do as little as possible. So Republicans objected to Social Security. They objected to Medicare. They objected to the idea that people have a right to live. And here we are now in the middle of another looming catastrophe. And anything good that has happened, I would submit, is by virtue of that catastrophe. So I'm cautiously hopeful that we might be able to move in really productive ways. Even the Biden administration's, what are they calling it? The Jobs Act. That's the first significant movement on an infrastructure policy that has environmental components that are at least beginning to vaguely acknowledge the scope of the problem.
Why do we as humans have to wait until the point of crisis for any change to actually happen?
Yeah, so be it. I think you're quite right. It's kind of corny, but, my mom and dad, they always used to give us all these folk aphorisms. And, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention. Okay, so be it. It will be quite necessary quite soon. And I don't have any purchase on what's ultimately a Nobel Prize winning question to the extent that we could address it effectively, and that is, what does one do to influence people? And there I'm almost speechless, except to note a few things. Like there was an Indian dude of yesteryear, Krishnamurti, and he said, everyone wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. And so let's start there. And again, here you are, young folks. You're not stockbrokers or going for your MBA. You're like, let's do something. And so this is good. It's a start. And, then I like the dead guy, Henry Miller, wrote novels in the last century. And that's where I got the Krishnamurti dude. And Henry Miller says, look, we all want to do something. Not we all, but enough people are right-minded. And of course, it would be awesome to do something consequential and transformational. And sure, let's hope that happens. But meanwhile, he argues, it's not for any of us to proclaim in advance whether we've been effective or not. Back to what we were talking about earlier. You're making a film, and that's going to be awesome. And you have a podcast, and there's maybe 20 people or whatever listening to it, but we just don't know. One of them may 20 years from now, I'll be dead in a jar of formaldehyde in front of this building. You guys will be squarely professional, but we just won't know. Somebody in 2 weeks might hear us talking, and that might encourage them to do something. And it might even be their kid that does something because of the connection. So I'm of this view, maybe I can't even remember if Henry David Thoreau said this or if I'm hallucinating, where he's talking like throwing a pebble in a pond at Walden, and you know how it just kind of ripples out and it keeps going. And we can't say, how far it will ripple and how many folks will be affected by the wake of our thoughts. So I just, I'm at a point where I don't think we have the luxury of waiting. I think it's all hands on deck and everybody doing what they can in a variety of ways, because we won't know what works, perhaps, until we try a lot of things.
Our feeling is that our drive toward action and solutions and our unwillingness to take a step back, slow down, and try to understand ourselves may hasten crises such as climate change and the ecological crisis. Can you describe how the myth of progress ties into this process?
Yeah, wow, that's again great set of queries, and here I'm borrowing from the British philosopher John Gray, who I've learned quite a bit from, and his point is that the Western view of progress that we tend to see as a product of the Enlightenment and as the epitome of rationality is in fact just a secularized version of the Christian view of heaven as the inevitable result of doing the right thing. So to back up a bit, what John Gray says is, look, I'm not knocking rationality, nor am I knocking progress. However, there's no evidence in the history of Earth that we progress in a linear fashion. And there's certainly no evidence, despite massive technological progress, that we've made even a millimeter of progress in terms of altering human nature. And that what happened in the Enlightenment, it was a confluence of a lot of activities. You got you got Darwin weighing in with evolution. You got the Industrial Revolution. You got Adam Smith and this the invisible hand, where if everybody's just like selfish, we'll all be better off. And we did. It seems like humanity got caught up in the understandable enthusiasm associated with what sure seemed to be a magical moment. And the idea that the world could get better to the point where everybody has enough, that's a noble vision, but it's also really diluted in light of what we know historically. And so to get back to the point, the argument is that one of the things that makes it difficult for us to step back, to slow down, and to consider what it means to be a human being, what might be the best set of beliefs, to imbue life with meaning and us with value, it is to back away from this notion that keep busy, keep earning money like the hamster on the exercise wheel, and everything must get better. And there are experiments. There are some Dutch psychologists who point out that those are death-denying beliefs. When they remind people that they're going to die, they become more militantly devoted to the idea that progress is inevitable. And if you show them an article saying, no, progress is not inevitable, that brings unconscious death thoughts more readily to mind. And I've been very long-winded, but I think that's because this is a really quintessentially important point. Many of us, myself included, particularly people my age, because we caught the ass end of the best moment in America, at least for white people. And that was the American dream, right? We won the war, we're the best, fuck the rest. You're going to do better than your parents if you work hard. And if you don't do better, that's your own fault. And that was almost true for a white guy. But the point is that that's never been true for humanity writ large. And it's certainly not true right now. And so, yes, I think a big point that we need to, as a society, make very explicit is to get people to attend to the idea that the notion of progress being inevitable is a death-denying delusion, and our incapacity to abandon it or even to step back long enough to subject it to critical scrutiny is one of the biggest impediments to doing anything constructive. And I see that playing out really every day right now in popular discourse, because anytime someone is, we may have to change the way we live. It's Dick Cheney, who was the vice president when George W. Bush, back before you guys existed, he just said the American way of life is not negotiable. And to which a local guy, Jim Kunstler, who writes great books about peak oil and stuff, he just says that's diluted. You have a new negotiating partner right now. It's called nature. And like it or not, you're going to get the short straw when it comes down to it. Feel free to assume that we'll always have enough water. We'll always have enough food. There'll always be enough arable land that we can farm with relentless impunity, as if dumping another couple of gazillion tons on top of already depleted topsoil is going to yield an infinite number of carrots. We have two choices. We either recognize that as a recipe for doom, or we begrudgingly acknowledge it as our children are wandering around on a desolate landscape, disemboweling each other for an acorn that they might stumble upon, and they fight a squirrel for it for lunch.
It seems like humanity hasn't anchored itself to the world and what is real. Instead, humanity is trying to conform the natural world to the demands of industrial capitalism and modern civilization. Do you feel like most of us in the modern world believe we are enacting a mythology or a story, or do you feel that there is a belief that we've transcended the need for those things?
No, brilliant. Yes, we do think we have, and of course, we've not. And that's the John Gray point, is that, and it's ironic because he's like, we're eager to dismiss the bumpkins of yesteryear that were enchanted by and engaged with these compelling myths that infuse our life with meaning and give us a sense of why we're here and what we should do while we're here. And a lot of folks in modernity, and I would have said this a couple of decades ago, are like, thank God we've disposed of those superstitions such that we can now see reality as it is. That's my objection to the, whatever they call them these days, the new atheists, the Sam Harrises and the Dawkins of the world, is they say that. Christopher Hitchens, he's like, I used to be deluded, but now I'm just reasonable. I see things as they actually are. Well, that's just unfortunately not true. Even atheism is a death-denying worldview. There are experiments where if you show atheists pieces of history to suggest that Jesus may have actually existed, that brings their death thoughts more readily to mind. Just showing that atheism, that's not like everyone else is deluded and we're not. It's like, no, everyone is deluded in different ways. You just harbor a particularly feeble and uninspired delusion, which is to arrogantly proclaim that which you could never know. I mean, the only proper stance would be an agnostic one. And I can't even remember, I'm so feeble, why I started talking about these things. What was I blubbering about?
The narrative.
The point is we're still, so the average person in the West, they're like, oh yeah, we're not blinded by nor determined by any of these narratives. But again, that's frankly untrue. The narrative that we now live by is the narcissistically sociopathic one that prevails in our society, and that's everybody for themselves. Greed is good. Growth is inevitable. People are by nature different, therefore inequality is natural and desirable. And the ultimate goal in life is, in our world, a meritocracy. As Michael Sandel, a philosopher at Harvard, points out in a recent book, The Tyranny of Merit, he's like, just look, what is it that drives our world? Well, we think about meritocracy. It sure sounds good, right? Everybody has a chance and we all compete to excel. And yet what Sandel points out is how extraordinarily psychotic and debilitating is that mentality, because the only thing that matters is to be the best at what you do. And that means that N-1 people in every category is a failure and a loser. And so we're no less driven by worldviews. It's just not as obvious what drives us, nor are we adequately aware of the debilitating effects of subscribing to a worldview that embraces values that are not realistically attainable. So again, what's our world? Money and stuff. Who's the best? People with lots of money and stuff. Yeah, but if you grow up where somebody says, if you tried hard enough, you can have as much money as Steve Jobs or Oprah, but if you don't, it's your fault. And then on top of that, if you're a woman, you've got to be thinner than linguine and you can't be any more than in your mid-20s. Well, that's a recipe for psychological despair. So no wonder we live in a culture driven by incessant pursuit of money and stuff amongst a demoralized and enraged population that apprehends themselves as failures by an incapacity to live up to a view of the world that I would submit is wrong-minded, if not completely demented. I know that sounds dire, but I think there's too many people on this hamster wheel to maintain a view of the world based on insatiable desire for material consumption. But that's crazy. To have infinite aspirations in a finite world, it is just mathematically ill-advised.
Part of the way that we make meaning is through outsourcing our self-esteem onto our appearance, our jobs, and all of our other external temporal attributes in the world. Can you describe your work with self-esteem and its relationship to death denial?
All right, so self-esteem. So our original thought, and this is just based on Becker's ideas, is that the self-esteem is the ultimate psychological imperative. In order to stand up in the morning, we need to think that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. and that's true, whether we like it or not. The problem is, or can be, that you can't get self-esteem for yourself, through yourself, by yourself, because it is a product of adhering to the standards of value that prevail in the culture that you subscribe to at a particular moment. And that's where self-esteem can be quite problematic. I like Virginia Woolf, how she put it. She's like, what creatures of illusion that we are, without self-confidence, we are like babes in the cradle. But that shifts the question to what do we do in a cultural moment where the prevailing values are not realistically attainable. And I believe this to be, again, a top priority for collective cogitation at this moment in time, where our work has drifted. And I believe this to be a nice, I believe this to be timely, important, and perhaps imperative moving forward on ecological grounds. The danger with self-esteem, it's a guy named Richard Beck, I believe, who wrote a book called The Slavery of Death. And he's an interesting gentleman. He's both a PhD experimental psychologist and an ordained minister, I believe. And his point is that, we do need self-esteem. But in our culture, where you get self-esteem by being the best at what you do, that's problematic, because we're valuing things that, if pursued diligently, ultimately produce narcissistic outcomes. And he's like, yeah, but what about in the old days, where both biblically and philosophically there was greater emphasis on humility and gratitude? All right, so if we go back to the ancients and the Epicureans like Lucretius, and they're like, okay, here you are, you're not here forever. And a lot of people are so apprehensive about dying. But if you think about it for a moment, there were eons before you got here, and that didn't seem to bother you. So why does it bother you so much that there'll be eons after you? Your atoms that make up you didn't make them. They were swirling around the cosmos before you. And then when you get done living, you just borrowed them. They're going to go back and become something else. And so from a lot of philosophical viewpoints, it's like, okay, you're an inconsequential speck of respiring carbon-based dust. You're born into a time and place not of your choosing. You're here for an infinitesimal amount of time before you're summarily obliterated and returned to the cosmos like every other living thing in the history of Earth. Why is that not an occasion for spontaneous exuberance? Why can't we, with humility, which is not self-deprecation, that's another problem with our culture, is the incapacity to view things like humility and gratitude as the ultimate expressions of courage, rather than to perceive them as congenital character flaws. And so there's been recent work by some of our colleagues that show that asking people to just think about being humble, or asking people to think about times in their lives where they've been grateful, that takes the edge off all of the ugly behaviors that our death reminders usually produce in the lab. You don't hate people that are different if you're grateful and then are asked to think about death. Ditto for being humble. And so this suggests where we might go with regard to conceiving of and ultimately constructing worldviews that might be useful and functional moving forward. We've got to come up with a way. Worldviews are not going to go away. We are mythological, narratizing creatures. We just need a better story. And we've got plenty of historical antecedents to borrow from, as you all know better than I. The matriarchal cultures of yesteryear, prior to the Judeo-Christian tradition, that sees us on this inexorable road to progress, well, that's one good place to start. And on the other hand, I don't think that we need to confine ourselves to antiquity. And so I think here we are in the enviable position of, if we can, as you mentioned earlier, if we can get off that hamster wheel. Eric Fromm, in a book called Escape from Freedom, written in the 1940s, he said, you know what? We keep ourselves so busy that we never sit still long enough to step back and consider if this is who we want to be and what we want to do. And so I think that that's really important. On the one hand, things are moving faster. On the other hand, it is the capacity to metaphorically and literally step back and to contemplate, and to do so consciously, and not to go all linguistic, but to do so consciously means that we do it together, because just the word conscious, con means with, and shus evidently is from some Greek word meaning to know. And so we need to do this together. And I think we need to get on it pretty quickly. And I don't see how it can happen, to be honest, in the absence of the kinds of projects that you're now involved with. Because here I'm like a doddering old timer. We write these books, we do these studies, 12 people read them. Nothing really changes. And so how do we even get a minor inroad on influencing folks, or even getting them to sit still for 10 minutes to entertain seriously these rather radical propositions? I think it's going to be projects along these lines. And now I'm going to, at the risk of sounding hypocritical, because it is almost that way, yeah, we're doomed if we can't get out of the Facebook, Twittering, TikTok world. And I don't see how we can do that without taking advantage of the Facebook, TikTok, Twittering world.
It seems that when we became conscious of our mortality in our evolution, we began a slow process of deconstruction, of breaking things down and trying to make sense of the world in a way that we perhaps didn't before we developed this awareness. One of the things that we have lost in this process of trying to explain the world through science and rationalism is the experience of awe. How can we take what we have learned and reconstruct our awareness of the interconnected mystery to inspire even more awe than before?
No, that's actually a wonderful way to think about it. And again, not to go academic-y, but while all of the great stuff in the Enlightenment was happening, you had this dead dude, Max Weber, at the beginning of the last century. And he's like, yeah, but we have sucked the meaning out of life. He referred to it as disenchantment. And there's a guy, I think he's still alive, but his name's Morris Berman. Great guy, he lives in Mexico. He gave up on America a couple of decades ago, but he wrote a book, and I can't remember the exact title, but it's about but the word re-enchantment is in the title. And yeah, I think that that's where we're at. We have become disenchanted, and rightfully so, with the prevailing vision of Earth. And yeah, we're in a race against time, as it were, to come up with a better one. And I know there was something I was thinking about when the neural net went down. So we got all of these the ancient wisdom, which we would be ill-advised to abandon. And I think on top of that, we can add some insights from the moment. And so there's a evolutionary biologist in Canada. His name is Lonnie Arson. And he wrote a book, I think it's called The Future of Humanity. And again, it doesn't really matter, I guess, all that much. But his point is that, yeah, we gotta take the best of what we already know. But there's some other things. So Rollo May, an existential psychotherapist, in a book called Cry for Myth, he quotes the astronauts that were the first ones that flew up to the moon and walked on the moon. And one of the astronauts was like, yeah, when you look at Earth for the first time from space, the first thing that you realize is that our cultural constructions are so feeble and they evaporate like mist in the wake of astronomical reality. He's like, I'm looking at Earth, I see the entire world every 90 minutes because we're traveling around it. I don't see any fences. I don't see any borders that people have been fighting over for thousands of years. Isn't this a new vision of humanity that we might parlay into something of enduring value? And what the Lonnie Arson dude points out is that human nature is not going to change, but what we might be able to do is to change who we define as being part of our tribe. Because humans are incredibly pro-social, uber cooperative, hyper altruistic creatures when we're dealing with whoever we consider to be part of our herd. We are unfortunately hardwired to be fascistically ethnocentric and derogatory and destructive to people who we deem as being not part of our group. And so my buddy Tom Pazinski and his students, they've done studies where they say to people, you know what? And this sounds corny, it's like some fucking Woodstock remnant. They say, we're all human beings. We have more in common than we are different. And humans are one big family. They call it a common humanity prime, which has the benefit of being true, by the way. We're a very homogenized group. Every human on Earth originated from a small population in Eastern Africa. And so anyway, when we do that, and then we remind people of death, they don't hate people who are different. And so when people say these days, that's Pollyanna, that's Mary Poppins, you guys are granola bar, Birkenstock clad, bong sucking hippies, get out of your Volvo and get a job, because what you're proposing is just not even natural. Yes, but it is quite natural. The trick is, how do we get humans to accept the fact that we're all in this together? And if we could do that, then we don't need a magical transformation of human nature. We just get, or need to rather, stimulate our pro-social, uber cooperative tendencies by broadening the scope of who we consider to be part of our world. If we can pull that off, then let's add the trees and the squirrels and corn. And if we can pull that off, some argue, let's take it the very next step And let's grant the status of existence to all things, be they animate or inanimate. If we were to start with the radical proposition that all things have standing, and to adopt a grateful, humble, welcoming stance to everything and everyone, let's see what that might lead to.
When we interviewed Derek Jensen, he explained to us that every living thing's life is as sacred as mine as to me, or yours is to you, that everything is sacred. Knowing this adds a layer of moral complexity, that life is only continued through death, via eating other beings. If everything is sacred, that challenges the lines we may draw on what is morally appropriate to eat. We can't draw arbitrary lines when we hold everything with reverence.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I wish I had more to say about the food issue, that because I share your concern without having anything to offer. But back to Erich Fromm and another book called The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Where Fromm's, it's back to the point that you just made, Jake. It was like, we're, like it or not, if you are alive and enjoy persisting, that can only be accomplished at the expense of other life forms. And Fromm's like, yeah, that if you've had a hamburger recently, but then you get the vegetarians. They're like, yeah, that's why I don't eat meat, to which Fromm or I would reply that carrot was doing just fine in the garden before you unceremoniously terminated its life in the service of your salad. And then my sister, wearing a bed sheet in California back in the day, she'd be like, yeah, that's why I don't yank any carrots. I wait for shit to fall off the trees, whatever those. And I'm not, I don't mean to sound glib here, because these are highly principled people. And I'm like, oh, yeah, so you waited for the apple to fall, but you had to walk across the lawn in order to get it, thus exterminating millions of microorganisms who did you no harm. And so this gets back to your point, and that is that any adequate appreciation of the reality of not only human existence, but the existence of life in general, sees us as all part of a giant system that does require the involuntary dissolution of other life forms in order to serve us. Well, okay, and so we have two choices, mas or menos. You can be like the Jains, are they in India, the ones that wear the masks and starve? Not knocking that. So we can choose to cease to exist, or we can step back and take a sober look at what it would mean to peacefully coexist under those conditions.
It seems that our separation from the life-death life cycle has caused us to bring about so much more destruction than if we were connected to it consciously. Has the denial of death allowed us to lay waste to the world?
Yeah, completely agreed with what you just said. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, who's famous for his book Being and Time, in the 1950s and 60s, he became more concerned about the adverse effects of our rampant dependence on technology and the implications that has for life and nature. And he said, and he framed it in what I would consider to be denial of death terms. He said, we are so hell-bent on exerting control over our surroundings in the service of a false sense of psychological equanimity that we try to change nature, his term that I love, into an infinite standing reserve. And there was a British professor, I was at a summer program in Oxford, and I like how he put it, and this is where I learned about these ideas. He just said, yeah, Heidegger's saying that this is why we're uncomfortable with nature. Nature, you're walking around in the woods and you're hungry, and there's no signs for a bistro. There's no machines. And he just said, we want life to be like a 24-hour convenience store. I want it, and I want it now. And I believe that that's really what it ultimately comes down to. And it is quite ironic, because those of us, and again, myself included, in our most death-denying moments, don't talk to me about killing a cow. That's why I want my package in the store to be wrapped in plastic and to say meat. Or not meat, to say beef. It can't say anything like flesh. It has to be labeled something different. And it can't look like an animal, and so on and so forth. And that's why we can't ever be around. We can't see dead people. I don't even want to see an old person. Don't talk to me about stuff dying. Yeah, I know it's a pandemic, but DoorDash still comes. And even when the power goes out, I sit there forlornly with the remote control, kind of clicking on the TV so I can find out when the power's going to come back on. Which is just my way of saying that I am no different. But Marion, your point, I think, is quite correct. And that's that when you see communities, even if they're quite small, that you would characterize as having a more sustainable relationship with nature, and is ultimately more defensible in terms of psychological and psychosocial well-being, that it is not one in which death is pushed under the psychological bushes. It is where you are able to accept the reality of nature, which is that we eat by eating. And yet, when embedded in an enchanted cultural arrangement, where the taking of another life is done always with great respect and reverence, there and only there do I see a possibility for a sustainable world. We're not going to get rid of death. And so, as you know, and that's why I love the title of your project, it's that we better get death and garden in the same phrase. Yeah.
Your work indicates that two uniquely human emotions are awe and dread. Has there been much research into the effects of awe, and is that something we need to cultivate more of?
Yeah. Yes, need more. So you want to look up a guy named Kirk Schneider. Okay. All right, he was a student of this Rollo May dude. He's a little bit younger than I, and he writes books about awe. And he would die as a really good dude. So you want to check this out. The things are now just drifting in that direction. And I think it is definitely where we need to head, because so we've been doing this for, 40 years or whatever. I stumble onto Becker's books in my first week as a professor, in the library. And we got hung up on the dread part, in part because of my own fears of dying. I've not been a big fan of expiring since I remember becoming aware of it when I was like 8. But Jeff and Tom and I, we were more interested in the malignant manifestations of death anxiety. We wanted to know, how come people are assholes? Why do we hate people who are different? And those kinds of concerns. But in so doing, we really have unintentionally, perhaps, not directed sufficient attention to the other side of the psychological ledger. So I believe it was Kierkegaard who said that self-consciousness is awesome as well as dreadful. And we need to not forget that. and we need to begin in earnest to create the conditions that render that a more common experience, which is natural to all of us. Again, I feel like an ass sometimes speaking as a professor instead of common sense masquerading as psychological insight, which is that all kids, except in extraordinarily impoverished circumstances, they're awed by everything. I love watching a little kid, like watch, a caterpillar for hours, or just so preoccupied with life that it gets dark out and they don't even realize that they've been out all day. So this is not about constructing awe. It's about resurrecting the way that we came into the world and to just kind of nudge us into that direction. Yeah, but there's no free lunch. I believe the existential philosophers who say that ultimately awe is the payoff that results from a mature confrontation with our mortality, where we can get to the point, and this is back to the Heidegger dude, where he's like, yeah, you have to accept that you're gonna die. And most people will be like, what are you talking about? I know I'm gonna die. And what you're really saying is, I know I'm gonna die at some vaguely unspecified future moment, not now. But Heidegger's point is that's still death denial. You're still putting some arbitrary chunks of humanly delineated time, hours, days, months, between you and death. A comet could come through this window and vaporize all of us in the next 5 seconds. Coming to terms with mortality is the vivid realization and acceptance of the fact that you will not only die, I will not only die, but my death is always potentially immediately impending and constitutes the utter obliteration of myself and anything that I think that I'm up to. If I get that far, well, then I'm getting there. If I can also come to terms with what these guys call existential guilt. And this is just, on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, well, I didn't choose to be born. I didn't choose to be born in a male body in New York in the middle of the last century. And like it or not, that constrains the things that are possible for me. And yet, I have no choice but to choose. And most people, they either decline to choose or refuse to accept responsibility for their poor choices. And in existential terms, that renders you subject. I love this poet dude, Maria Rilke. He was a Romanian guy, and he talked about the guilt of unlived life. And I love that phrase. And Henry Miller says it another way. We're all guilty of a crime, the great crime of not living life to the fullest. All right, well, if you can get over those existential humps, come to terms with death, accept responsibility for your choices, then on the other side of that, I love how Heidegger describes it. He says that life then begins to feel like you're on this ongoing adventure that's perfused with unshakable joy. So there's this awe on the other side of an excruciating existential process that, while not always pleasant, is necessary if we're to ultimately get the full richness of what life has in store for us. Again, it gets back to, as Americans, we're all eager to claim the upside. I want life to be all spontaneous exuberance, which it indeed is in our finest moments. But that's only the result of having gone through the psychodynamic work of accepting the inevitability of the undercurrents of life. And so if we come to terms with death and if we accept responsibility for our choices, that doesn't obliterate anxiety or suffering. What it does, though, is to reposition it in a world where we can accept that. And not only accept it, but embrace it as part of what it means of necessity to be a human being.
You include in your book this quote from Albert Camus: "Come to terms with death, thereafter anything is possible." Our feeling is that this applies to everything, including the death of our civilization. Rather than that being a nihilistic perspective, it's actually quite optimistic in that it liberates us to problem solve in ways that we wouldn't have without the acknowledgement of the finitude of life and systems.
No, love that. That's a really lovely, and again, back to the Henry Miller guy who I like a lot. And yeah, he talks about, look, the ultimate prerogative as a human being is that we get to participate in the construction of ourselves and the world around us. And that in our finest moments, we can turn this into an artistic venture. And I share your affection for Camus. And I love that thought, come to terms with death, thereafter anything is possible. Yeah, even if that's a high bar, something to approximate but not ever attain, why not set the bar high? And also, why not toss in another Camus thought that I think it's the last line of The Plague, where Camus says, we learn in a time of pestilence that there is more to admire in men than to despise. And I would add women to that, not to make this gendered prose, but again, at the risk of sounding psychotically enthused about the present moment, yeah, the pandemic's been terrible. And of course, we wouldn't wish the chaos and devastation on anyone. But for those of us that are lucky enough to have not been imperiled by all of this, yeah, maybe there really is a hope, and that is that in the midst of all this death and destruction, it has served as a poignant and profound wake-up call for enough of our fellow travelers on the orb that we now reside on, that, something of enduring value could come of this. And I like your point a whole lot, because it's not just about coming to terms with my demise. It's the acceptance that what that also entails is being willing to let go of a way of life that is equivocal, because it's been great for a lot of us to a certain point. I think that's the hard part, is how do we let go of a worldview that has gotten us to where we're sitting in a chair and we drove here today and we're alive, and yet if we keep doing it, only cockroaches and jellyfish will be here a couple of thousand years from now. Yeah.
How can we, in our day-to-day lives, deal with existential dread?
Yeah, wow. So the good news is I don't think that there's one size that fits all. And so I've already emphasized no harm in repeating that my current preoccupation is with this idea of gratitude and humility, being something that all of us that had lunch and slept in a bed, we can be grateful. All of us ought be humble. So I think that's one possibility, because it's doable. Another, and I don't know how to go about this, but this is your agenda, it's to get ourselves reacquainted with and re-enchanted by nature. The fact that we live in a world, and again, I don't mean to sound glib, but before the pandemic, I was in Italy and then I was in California, and if I see one more person looking at a redwood tree through their fucking smartphone so that they can paste the picture on Facebook, then I'm going to set myself on fire in the parking lot, which probably wouldn't bother the people that are taking the picture. But here we are. We're bored by nature, but captivated by Amazon and the mediated world that pretends to be alive but's really not. So I don't know how we're going to invert that to rebalance ourselves, but I do believe that's something else that we need to think about. The main thing is what you guys came in with to begin with. I think the overriding prerequisite to anything good happening is to raise to the level of explicit awareness in the hope of productive engagement by a large chunk of humanity. It is, we've got to make the unconscious conscious, that all of us, myself included, are both the beneficiaries and victims of a worldview that implicitly assumes that things will necessarily get better and that technological progress is assured, and that all of our problems will be summarily addressed as a result. And until we can expose progress as a worthy goal, but also an ideologically riven, death-denying delusion, I think we're in danger of keep going on what's going to be a path that, as we put it in our work, renders the earth uninhabitable and us the first form of life to have the ignominious distinction of being responsible for our own extinction.
In The Worm at the Core, you describe an interesting theory that agriculture began as a result of humans erecting religious monuments and structures as a means of relating to death anxiety, which required humans to sedentarize in a way that they hadn't before. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So this is a minority view, but we wrote our book, The Worm at the Core, and we had a chapter where we were trying to learn about the evolution of culture. And I already knew from previous work that the party line is that, we went from nomadic hunter-gatherers to living in towns in order to farm. And it was just this kind of rational progression. But then other folks, archaeologists, realized that that wasn't true. There's clear evidence of people living in communities 1,000 years before the development of agriculture. And then other people are like, yeah, well, you know what? It couldn't have been simple and rational. It couldn't have been that we were hunter-gatherers and someone's like, this is fucking tiresome. Let's just sit here and grow a fucking potato, as if you would know how to do that. And so what other folks have suggested, and there's the book that we quote from is by a guy named Grant Allen, and of course I've forgotten the name of the book, but his view, and the archaeologist, by the way, from Oxford that discovered that we settled down long before we started to farm, their point is we settled down for religious purposes, that it was to build monuments to deities. And in our view, that was a result of just burgeoning consciousness, that as we became increasingly aware of ourselves, that it became psychodynamically more imperative to come up with worldviews that provided more compelling assurances of immortality. Other folks suggest that those worldviews just developed to make it easier for larger numbers of people to interact with each other. Be that as it may, the point is, though, that there's somewhat clear evidence that agriculture may have developed as an offshoot of burial rituals. So here we were living in a town, building these big religious monuments, and we still had to be hunter-gatherers, but we started burying ancestors with grave goods, including the best of our crops. And then the argument is that we may have noticed that in the former places where we were putting our dead relatives, that's where the best crops were growing. So that agra-culture, remember, culture we have already defined as death-denying belief systems. This raises the possibility that agriculture originated in part in the context of religious rituals that had death-denying components. Whether or not that proves to be correct is an open issue. What I do know, though, is that this idea that we were wandering around and then said, oh, yeah, let's fuck that. Let's not do that anymore. Let's become farmers. That's clearly not even tenable logistically. So I am preoccupied with this idea that lots of technical progress is an offshoot of religious belief systems that were designed at first to deny death. Organic chemistry is the result of the ancient Taoists trying to get elixirs of life by turning lead into gold. They didn't make it anywhere, but we have organic chemistry because of that.
What do you want to have happen to your body when you die?
Well, okay. What in my last, I'll tell you, I either want to be cremated and buried in the backyard of our house, where all of our pets for 30 years reside, as well as rocks and sticks. And if my wife Maureen was here, first of all, she would love to meet you, and you would like her. So she builds with popsicle sticks, little paths so insects can walk in and out of our house unmolested. And it's a stance towards life that I believe to be uplifting. So that would be one possibility. But amongst her many qualities is not a great affinity for linear time. If I said to my wife, meet me at the end of time, she would be late. But so another option is to be cremated and to have my ashes put in a little egg timer. And I'm assuming she lives longer than I'm going to tell her that it's 4 minutes, but it'll be only 3 minutes worth of ashes so that we could pick up the pace a little bit. And she's like, fuck you, I'm not going to go any faster. Yeah. So, yeah, and then if there's anything left over, fertilize. I am very interested in the death positive ideas, and am enamored with, if this could be scaled up, two ways that the carcass that I currently reside in, to be dualistic for the moment, can be put to use somehow. Yeah.